On a dark road, in the dead of night, a confrontation is brewing. On one side, a decorated U.S. senator. On the other, a police officer with a badge, a gun, and an attitude that screams trouble. A simple traffic stop turns into a terrifying standoff. A threat is made. A weapon is drawn. It's a moment that could have ended in tragedy. But what the officer didn't know, is that he was being watched. And in a stunning turn of events, he would be the one leaving in the back of a police car. Stick around to see how one brave witness changed everything. The night had draped itself over the Alorian highway like a shroud of deep velvet, a profound and welcome silence broken only by the hypnotic hum of Senator Arthur Vance's sedan. He navigated the ribbon of asphalt with a practiced precision, his hands steady at 10 and 2, his mind methodically unwinding from the day's dense tapestry of legislative battles and political chess matches. The world outside was an ocean of darkness, and for a fleeting moment, there was a profound sense of peace. That peace was shattered in an instant. A sudden, violent bloom of crimson and cobalt erupted in his rearview mirror, a silent, pulsating scream of light that tore through the tranquility and painted his cabin in harsh, alternating hues. His first reaction was not alarm, but a flicker of cool, analytical confusion, the instinct of a man whose life was governed by rules and reason. He had committed no infraction. A quick glance at the speedometer confirmed his adherence to the limit, his driving had been flawless. With a sigh that carried the weight of an unwelcome and illogical intrusion, he signaled, guiding the car onto the gravel shoulder. As the police cruiser rolled to a stop behind him, its headlights pinned his vehicle in a sterile, interrogative glare, and a subtle disquiet, the premonition of an encounter gone awry, began to prickle beneath his composure. The wait that followed was a study in psychological warfare. It was too long, too deliberate, a calculated pause designed to unnerve. Finally, the cruiser's door creaked open, and a figure emerged. Officer Deckard was silhouetted against the blinding light, his form rendered anonymous and menacing, his posture radiating a rigid, almost brittle authority that felt unearned and over-rehearsed. The crunch of his boots on the loose gravel was not the sound of an approach, but of an encroachment, each step a deliberate beat in a rhythm of impending confrontation. Vance lowered his window, the cool night air rushing in, carrying with it the scent of pine and damp earth. He kept his hands intentionally visible on the steering wheel, a universal gesture of compliance and de-escalation. The beam of Deckard's flashlight was not a tool for illumination but an instrument of interrogation. It sliced through the darkness, sweeping across the car's empty passenger seat before landing on Vance's face with a deliberate, blinding intensity. "Good evening, officer," Vance stated, his voice a model of measured calm, the same tone that had silenced contentious committee rooms. The response was a clipped, impersonal command, devoid of any protocol or courtesy. "License and registration." The words were flat, and Deckard's jaw worked on a piece of gum with an insolent, rhythmic slowness that grated on the nerves. "May I ask the reason for the stop, officer?" Vance inquired, his voice still even but now imbued with a quiet firmness. This was his own field of battle, the application of rules and the expectation of justification. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken challenge. Deckard simply repeated the demand, his voice lower this time, each word a stone dropped into the tense air. "License. Registration." Recognizing the futility of reason against a wall of obstinance, Vance acquiesced, though his caution was now on high alert. "Of course, officer. I'm reaching for my wallet in the center console," he announced, his movements slow and telegraphed. He retrieved the wallet, flipping it open to reveal not only his driver's license but also the gleaming, unmistakable seal of the United States Senate on his official ID. He extended it, expecting this emblem of established power to act as a circuit breaker, to restore normalcy to a situation spiraling away from it. Deckard took the wallet, but his eyes barely glanced at the identification. A contemptuous smirk played on his lips. "Senator, huh?" The word dripped with a corrosive skepticism, a deliberate insult aimed at diminishing not just the title, but the man himself. Then came the order, flat and final, that stripped away any remaining pretense of a routine stop. step out of the vehicle. The command was not a request, it was a gauntlet thrown down on the cold asphalt. It was a challenge that had nothing to do with the law, and everything to do with a brutish, naked assertion of power. In that moment, Senator Vance understood he was no longer a lawmaker on a highway, he was simply a man facing another man with a gun and a deep-seated need to prove he was in control. The command, "Step out of the vehicle," did not so much break the silence as it poisoned it. The words hung in the frigid night air, sharp and dissonant as a shard of broken glass, severing the last thread of civility. It wasn't the directive itself that struck Senator Vance with such force, but its profound and naked illegitimacy. In his world, a world meticulously constructed from statutes, precedents, and the clearly defined architecture of law, every action was predicated on reason. This order was a grotesque anomaly, a raw, baseless exertion of will that stood in stark defiance of the very principles he had sworn to uphold. His mind, accustomed to navigating the intricate corridors of diplomacy and legislation, processed the command not as a lawful directive, but as a declaration of hostilities. He drew a slow, deliberate breath, the cold air filling his lungs, and let it center him. Panic was a luxury he could not afford, a wildfire that would consume the very clarity he needed to survive this. "Officer, with all due respect," he began, his voice maintaining its unnerving calm, a disciplined counterpoint to the simmering aggression that radiated from the figure outside his window. "That is an unlawful order. You have yet to articulate a single, credible reason for this stop, let alone a cause to compel me from the safety of my vehicle." He paused, a tactical silence designed to let the weight of his logic settle. "I suggest we de-escalate this. The proper protocol is clear. Please, call your supervisor to the scene. I will wait." The suggestion of oversight, of a higher authority, was a spark thrown onto a pool of gasoline. Officer Deckard's carefully constructed facade of bored authority cracked, shattering to reveal the raw, incandescent ego beneath. His jaw stopped its insolent chewing, his muscles tensing. His eyes, which had been cold and dismissively scanning the interior, now narrowed into points of pure, concentrated venom, locking onto Vance with an intensity that was almost physical. "Supervisor," he sneered, the word twisted with a contempt so profound it was almost theatrical. "I am the authority out here. I don't need a supervisor to handle some overprivileged, smart-mouthed politician who thinks his title makes him untouchable." In that moment, the situation irrevocably shifted. It was no longer a procedural disagreement, it had devolved into a primal contest of wills, a dangerous game being played on a deserted highway under the cold, indifferent gaze of the stars. Deckard's right hand moved with a chilling fluidity from his belt to his hip, his fingers brushing against the cold, textured grip of his firearm. His other hand, with a deliberate, almost sensuous slowness, unfastened the leather snap on his holster. The sound was soft, a mere click, but in the charged, suffocating silence of the night, it echoed with the deafening finality of a chambered round. It was a clear, unambiguous threat, a translation of his wounded pride into the universal language of violence. "I said," he repeated, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl that seemed to emanate from his very core, "Get out of the car. Now." Vance's gaze remained locked on Deckard's, his mind a whirlwind of frantic calculation. He had read the internal affairs reports, seen the heartbreaking, grainy news segments of routine stops that had spiraled into tragedy over far less, a perceived slight, a misunderstood gesture. He understood the lethal calculus of a fragile ego armed with a badge and a loaded weapon. His Senate ID, his years of service, his reputation, they were just paper and words, meaningless abstractions against the primal, visceral language this man now spoke. Before Vance could formulate another response, another appeal to a reason that had clearly fled the scene, Deckard acted. He took a half-step forward, his body looming in the window frame, a dark silhouette blotting out the world, and his hand shot out, grabbing the door handle. The metallic clink of his fingers curling around the exterior handle sent a jolt, not of fear, but of pure, instinctual adrenaline, through Vance's body. Thought evaporated, replaced by raw survival instinct. His own left hand shot out, his fingers wrapping around the interior handle in a grip of iron. The cold metal of the door became the physical battleground, the epicenter of their deadlock. Through the thin steel, Vance could feel the brute force of Deckard's pull, a desperate, frustrated strength fueled by rage and a crumbling sense of control. He held his ground, his muscles coiled and burning, his entire being focused on that single point of resistance. The air in the cabin grew thick, heavy, and suffocating. The world had shrunk to this single, terrifying point of pressure, a silent, dangerous waltz on the edge of a precipice. And Vance knew, with a chilling and absolute certainty, that one wrong move, one miscalculation, one slip of his grip, would send them both tumbling into the abyss. Time had ceased to be a linear progression, it had become a thick, viscous medium in which every second was a struggle. For Senator Vance, the universe had contracted to a series of visceral, overwhelming sensations, the searing burn that radiated from his shoulder down his arm, the cold, unyielding metal of the door handle biting into the palm of his white-knuckled hand, and the sound of his own strained, ragged breathing in the claustrophobic confines of his car. The world outside the glass was a distorted, nightmarish canvas, a chaotic strobe of flashing red and blue lights that illuminated the contorted, furious face of a man who had shed every last vestige of his sworn duty. Vance was at the very end of his options. His formidable arsenal of logic, reason, diplomacy, and status had been rendered utterly useless, leaving only this primal, physical contest against a force of pure, unchecked aggression. The abyss he had sensed earlier was no longer a distant, metaphorical threat, he was dangling over its precipice, held by a thread of wool that was perilously close to snapping. Officer Deckard, in his state of incandescent fury, had become a creature of pure, kinetic energy. A low, guttural sound, more animalistic than human, escaped his lips with each powerful heave against the door, the sinews in his neck standing out like taut, thick cords. In his eyes, a wild, frantic light had supplanted any semblance of professional discipline. He was no longer an officer of the law-enforcing order, he was a cornered predator, thrashing against the perceived insult to his absolute authority, blind to consequence, deaf to reason, his entire being focused on the singular, obsessive goal of breaking through this final, infuriating barrier of defiance. The very air around them crackled with the ozone of imminent, explosive violence. One more pull, one more surge of adrenaline, and the fragile boundary of glass and steel would surely give way to something terrible and irreversible. And then, from the heart of that charged silence, it came. It was not a sound born of their constricted world of struggle, but one that seemed to pierce it from another dimension entirely, a voice that was neither loud nor shrill, but carried an impossible weight. "Hey! I'm recording this." The words were a blade of sound, clear, steady, and utterly, seismically unexpected. They sliced through the suffocating tension with the clean, sharp finality of a guillotine severing a rope. The effect on Officer Deckard was instantaneous and absolute, as if an invisible switch had been flipped deep within his nervous system. His entire body went rigid, a violent, involuntary spasm that locked his muscles in place. The immense, forward-driving pressure on the door handle vanished, leaving a sudden, disorienting void where immense force had been. The momentum of his rage, so powerful and all-consuming a moment before, was instantly and completely arrested. He froze, his arms still outstretched, his hands still curled grotesquely around the handle, but now it was a pose of weakness, a monument to his own transgression. The mask of fury crumbled from his face, replaced by a wave of slack-jawed, stupefied disbelief. This was followed swiftly by the dawning, stark, and abject horror of a man realizing, in a single, heart-stopping moment, that he has been caught, utterly and irrevocably, in the act of his own damnation. For Vance, the sudden release of pressure was a physical and psychological shock. His own muscles, braced for continued resistance, ached in the sudden vacuum. For a half-second, his mind couldn't process the change, the jarring shift from imminent violence to dead silence. Then, the words registered, and a profound, tidal wave of relief washed over him, so potent and overwhelming it was almost dizzying. It was a lifeline thrown into the abyss from an unseen hand, a sudden, miraculous intervention from a guardian angel he didn't know he had. He slowly, deliberately, turned his head, his gaze following the source of the voice, half expecting it to be a phantom of his own desperate hope. There, standing about 30 feet away on the grassy verge, bathed in the chaotic, strobing wash of the police lights, was a lone figure. A woman. She held her phone aloft, not like a weapon to be wielded, but like a shield to be held, its small, unwavering red light a tiny, glowing eye of judgment in the vast darkness. It was the unblinking eye of accountability, a silent, digital witness that had just captured a truth more powerful and more absolute than any badge, any gun, any shouted command. Her stance was not aggressive, but rooted, her expression a portrait of quiet, resolute defiance that seemed to draw strength from the very ground she stood upon. The highway shoulder, which moments ago had been Officer Decker's personal kingdom of intimidation, his stage for a brutal one-act play of power, was instantly transformed. The script had been violently, irrevocably rewritten. The silence that now fell was no longer the taut, stretched silence of imminent conflict, but the heavy, charged silence of assessment, of a new reality being forged in real time. Officer Deckard was no longer the predator, he was the prey, pinned in the glare of a light far more damning and far-reaching than his own headlights. And the whole world was about to become the audience. The grainy video, captured by Ilara's unwavering hand, was not merely footage, it was a contagion of truth. Before the sun had fully crested the Elorian horizon, it had already broken containment, escaping the flickering confines of social media feeds to metastasize across the vast, unforgiving landscape of the national consciousness. It played on a continuous, hypnotic loop on every news network, a stark digital ghost haunting the nation's living rooms. The sneer on Deckard's face, the chilling, definitive click of the holster snap, the raw, unhinged aggression juxtaposed against Senator Vance's preternatural, almost glacial calm, these images were seared into the collective psyche. The clip became a viral Rorschach test for the country, and in its stark, pixelated frames, millions saw a chilling reflection of their own fears, their own unheard stories of power abused on lonely, forgotten roadsides. The Louisiana State Police headquarters in Meridian, a building once seen as a bastion of order, was besieged, not by a mob with pitchforks, but by something far more potent, the relentless, penetrating gaze of cameras and the pointed, unyielding questions of a press corps that smelled a deep, systemic rot. In the quiet, wood-paneled sanctuary of his office, a space typically insulated from the world's clamor, Senator Arthur Vance watched the storm he had survived now rage across the country. His phone buzzed and vibrated with a frantic, desperate energy on the mahogany desk, a chorus of aides, colleagues, and opportunistic commentators all demanding a piece of his narrative. He let it sing its unanswered tune. His focus was on the muted television screen, where pundits with self-assured expressions dissected his ordeal with a detached, clinical analysis, reducing his near-death experience to a series of political talking points. He felt no surge of vindication, no flush of triumphalism. Instead, a quiet, cold, and resolute determination began to crystallize within him, hardening his resolve. The incident on the highway was no longer a personal trauma to be overcome, it had become public property, a symbol. And a symbol, he knew with the practiced instinct of a lifelong politician, was a tool, or, if wielded correctly, a weapon. The official fallout was swift and decisive, a flurry of activity born not of moral awakening, but of a desperate, panicked attempt at damage control. By mid-afternoon, the department announced that Officer Deckard had been summarily stripped of his badge and charged with a litany of felonies, assault with a deadly weapon, official misconduct, unlawful imprisonment, that carried the crushing weight of years behind bars. His silent accomplice, Officer Miller, was suspended indefinitely, his passive complicity now viewed as a damning indictment of the institutional culture that enabled it. A carefully worded statement of profound regret was issued by the chief of police, but its polished, corporate language was a flimsy shield against the tidal wave of public outrage. This was no longer about one bad apple. The entire orchard was now suspect, and the public was demanding to inspect the roots. That evening, Vance made the most important call of the day, not to a fellow senator or a party leader, but to the private number of Ilara. Her voice was cautious, wary of the storm she had unleashed. "This isn't over," he told her, his own voice devoid of its usual political cadence, replaced by a raw sincerity. It's just beginning. And I can't do it from Washington. I need to do it with you, in Meridian. The community center was a low brick building, its walls adorned with the hopeful, hand-painted flyers of a dozen local programs. It served as the city's humble heart, and that night, its heart was beating with a powerful, unified pulse. The hall was packed to overflowing, a living mosaic of the community, mothers holding sleeping children on their hips, their faces etched with a familiar worry, weary laborers in their work clothes, their hands calloused but their eyes sharp, young, fiery activists with notebooks and a thirst for justice, and retirees who had seen this same story play out 100 times before, now wondering if this time, finally, the ending might be different. When Vance stepped to the podium, he set aside the folder of prepared notes his staff had assembled. He spoke not as a senator cloaked in the armor of his office, but as a citizen who had stared into the abyss and had been pulled back by a stranger's courage. What happened to me on that highway was not new, he began, his voice resonating with a profound, unvarnished honesty that quieted the room. It was just caught on camera. My title, my position, that night, they meant nothing. If it weren't for Alara, he said, gesturing to where she stood near the front, I might be another name, another statistic, another family's private grief. But most people don't have a camera. Most people don't have a title. We are here tonight to become their voice. To become their witness. In the end, Officer Deckard's badge and gun were no match for Alara's cell phone and her courage. But this story isn't just about one bad cop or one brave witness. It's a reminder that accountability doesn't just happen. It's built, one person at a time, one moment at a time. The system isn't perfect, but it bends when enough hands push. You don't need a title or a position of power to make a difference. All you need is the courage to see something wrong, and the will to not look away. What will you do the next time you're a witness? Thanks for watching.